There are two ways in our Constitution to amend the Constitution. The first way is the way that we've always done it throughout our history. There are 27 amendments to the Constitution. And am I not talking loud enough? There are two ways to amend the U.S. Constitution in Article 5. The first is via Congress, and that is the way throughout our history that we have done amendments to our U.S. Constitution. However, we all know the state of Washington, D.C., and it's horrific, and we feel that Washington, D.C. is a clear and present danger to America, our way of life, and generally our republic. So we feel that it's time to use the second way, which is by the state legislatures. We feel that we can trust Senator Crane to make the decisions for us and call a convention of states and rein in the federal government. That's what the Convention of States is about. The application was filed in Georgia in March of this past year. We voted on it. The GOP caucus in both the House and the Senate voted to apply for a Convention of States. We were the first state in the nation to do so. That being said, our call is to, 1, rein in the power and jurisdiction of the federal government. 2, to institute term limits upon federal officials, not just Congress. Federal officials, period. That could be the Supreme Court. It could be Lois Lerner. It could be any federal official. And to institute fiscal restraint upon the federal government. Those three topics are the topics by which we think that we can maybe get America back on the right track. So, and this all correlates with Mark Levin's book, The Liberty Amendments. And I don't know if any of you have read that, but I would recommend that you do, because the Convention of States is going to be a huge topic in the next couple of years. We passed, not only did we pass it in Florida, but immediately following Florida, we passed it in Alaska and Florida last year. I joined this movement almost a year ago now, and I, like you, I've been a Republican my entire life, coming from Indiana. I was born a conservative. I practice conservative values. My parents always had their own business. I have taken that and I have my own business now. So I believe in freedom and liberty, and I feel like we're under attack, and it's time for the American people to stand and do what needs to be done and not leave it in the hands of Washington, D.C. any longer. We can see Senator Crane. We can see our House Assembly members at the grocery store. When do you see your congressman and your senator from Georgia? Very rarely. They vote with the people up there, not with the people here. So that's why we're doing what we're doing. We're organizing in the state of Georgia. There are 180 House districts here. We already have volunteers in 173 of those districts. We have district captains in 52 of those districts. Your district captain for Convention of States is Thomas Grand Prix. He's part of your group. He supports Convention of States, and he has his volunteer base here. And we are organizing. Since we've already passed it in Georgia, we're also helping other states to spread the word, because without another 31 states, we will not be successful in calling the convention. But as you know, we're running out of time. And liberty needs to sweep our land, and this is the way that we can do it. And we can do it quickly. So that's what I'm here about, and that's, I'll be answering questions for you. But generally, we are calling an Article 5 convention to rein in the power and jurisdiction of the federal government, impose fiscal restraint upon the government, and to impose term limits upon federal officials. Because we think here in the state of Georgia that our people know better than Washington, D.C. Thank you.
The question that came to my mind is changing the Constitution, and that's really what we're talking about. Is changing the Constitution really the answer to what ails our country? Advocates, as you heard, advocates of an Article 5 convention contend that federal abuse of America's rights, freedoms, and property is due to a lack of clarity in the enumerated powers set out in Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution. They argue the remedy is to make changes to the Constitution that clarify and place additional limits on federal jurisdictions and powers, as you heard Jackie say. As I said, when I first heard about Citizens for Self-Governance national push for a convention to propose changes to the Constitution, my first reaction was, why do we need to amend the Constitution? The federals haven't paid attention to it for the last 150 years. Exactly. But when the Georgia legislature adopted Senate Resolution 371, renewing an application to Congress to call for a convention for the purpose of proposing, quote, an amendment to the Constitution and other purposes, end quote, I started taking the matter seriously and began researching, and this notebook back here is part of the research. I had a lot of reading to do. Curiously, I found the arguments offered by the Convention of the States Project justifying the need for changes in the Constitution actually reveal that the amendments cannot address the real problem. Meanwhile, the proven remedy for federal abuse that was advocated by Madison, Jefferson, and Hamilton, and by the way is currently being employed by more than half of the states, including Georgia, is casually dismissed by Convention of the States advocates. I found the Convention of the States' central argument that changes to the Constitution are needed to clarify the meaning of the enumerated powers to be what people who engage in formal debate call an argument ignoranto and lici, which is an argument with an irrelevant conclusion. Here's what I mean. Michael Ferris, the leader of a Convention of the State Project, writes, the federal government has gradually amassed overwhelming power that is clearly outside the boundaries that the framers intended when they wrote the Constitution. Now think about that for a moment. If it's clear the federal government is overstepping the limits of the constitutional powers, doesn't that say the problem is not a lack of clarity, which is what they're saying we need to make amendments for it, is to clarify them, right? So what is the real problem? Unwittingly, Mr. Ferris reveals that it is the government is deliberately misconstruing the Constitution. He writes, the two most abused provisions of the Constitution, the Interstate Commerce Clause and the General Welfare Clause, have been amenable to abuse because they were not written tightly enough to effectively implement the drafter's intention. You hear that? Amenable to abuse. Abuse is exploitation, manipulation. That's an act of intention. So as we see from his own words, the problem is not a lack of clarity, it's a matter of intentional abuse. And I might add, in need of an appropriate counterbalancing check. If the government's overreach of its delegated powers was simply due to an ambiguous exposition of two clauses, then clarification would be appropriate. But when the government chooses to parse words in order to rationalize the exercise of powers not granted, that is a problem of a very different sort, one unlikely to be remedied by wordsmithing. For as Plato once said, good people do not need laws to tell them to act responsibly, while bad people will find a way around the laws. That's as true today as it was in the 5th century BC. For the first 125 years after the Constitution's ratification, federal judges had little problem understanding the limits of federal power as written and intended. Then, beginning with Woodrow Wilson's administration in 1913, the Constitution started to be interpreted as a living document, which is to say its meaning is not discovered through a literal and commonsensical discovery, or by reading Madison, Hamilton, and Jay's explanation in the Federalist Papers, but by whoever's in power wants it to mean. When Wilson, our first progressive president, expressed open contempt for the founders and argued that the meaning of the Constitution should be interpreted by judges and not based on its words, because in his view, government as structured in the Constitution was insufficient for the challenges of the modern era. In the progressive view, the executive needs extensive power to act on his or her own without Congress. Does that sound familiar? Yeah. Chief Justice John Evans Hughes, who served on the High Court during FDR's administration, characterized the living Constitution this way: we are under a Constitution, but the Constitution is what the judges say it is. In other words, the rule of man, not the rule of law. That is the very thing the founders fought to overthrow. The rule of man is the hallmark of dictators, monarchs, and tyrants of whatever title. It's no surprise then, with the Supreme Court and other branches of the government operating by a living Constitution, the Bill of Rights has been turned upside down. In the progressive construction of American government, we the people are not sovereign, and the states have no right to check federal abuses. So that which the people created, the federal government, to be their agent and servant has turned into a master, that dictates everything from what kind of light bulbs and toilet flushes we can use, and even what we can say without penalty in our houses of worship. Intentional disregard of the Constitution is why there is no sphere of private life left untouched by government meddling today. Does anyone believe that Chief Justice John Roberts really thinks the Affordable Health Care Act is constitutional? Do you think the government doesn't understand that it is trampling our Fourth Amendment right to be secure in our persons, houses, papers, and effects when it indiscriminately monitors our emails, phone calls, financial records, health and school records? Are Congress, the President, and the Supreme Court unaware that the power to indefinitely detain and even execute American citizens without charges or due process is a blatant violation of our Fifth Amendment unalienable right not to be deprived of life, liberty, or property without due process? Of course they're aware. This is a government that deliberately violates and makes a mockery of the Constitution as written and intended. Given this reality, how can we not consider the possibility, indeed the probability, that the federal government will ignore and twist any modifications of the Constitution, especially any intended to curb government power and benefits? Why would we expend time and effort on a convention that cannot correct the real problem when we can simply apply more of a remedy that has already begun the process of restoring federalism, the rule of law, and the free market? The solution to which I refer is we, the people, reasserting our sovereignty through the voice of our state governments who are saying no to unconstitutional federal acts and need to start saying no to federal money that funds activities constitutionally prohibited to the federal government. Here's what three of our founders had to say about this rightful remedy, to borrow a term from Tom Jefferson. But where the powers are assumed which have not been delegated, a nullification of the act is the rightful remedy. He said that in 1798. This is what Madison said. The states, then, being parties to the Constitution Compact, and in their sovereign capacity, it follows of necessity that there can be no tribunal above their authority to decide in the last resort whether the compact made by them be violated, and consequently that as the parties to it, they must themselves decide in the last resort such questions as may be of sufficient magnitude to require their interposition. Hamilton said no legislative act contrary to the Constitution can be valid. And he went on to say, the state legislatures will jealously and closely watch the operations of government and be able to resist with more effect and every assumption the power of any other power on earth can do. Convention of the State Advocates dismissed the idea of state resistance to unconstitutional federal acts as being, quote, not grounded in the text of the Constitution and having no realistic chance of success. Let's examine both assertions. The right to assist federal government abuses of the Constitution is found in the 9th and 10th Amendments, provided, as Alexander Hamilton put it, the citizen understands their rights and are disposed to defend them. The powers, Madison said, the powers delegated by the proposed Constitution to the federal government are few and defined. Those which remain to the states and state governments are numerous and indefinite. Amendment number 10 says the powers not delegated to the United States by the Constitution nor prohibited by it to the states are reserved to the states respectively or to the people. The 9th Amendment says the enumeration in the Constitution of certain rights shall not be construed to deny or disparage others retained by the people. So if it's not delegated, specifically delegated to the federal government, whose power is it? It's our power. It's the states. It's the people. The right to say no to unconstitutional federal acts is not prohibited to the states or the people. We know Madison, the father of the Constitution and author of the Bill of Rights, endorsed the idea. Obviously, the states retain the right to resist federal assumptions of powers. So contrary to the federal government's claim and the Convention of the States assertion, the states and the people do have a right to judge the constitutionality of federal acts and to resist acts they find to be deliberately, palpably, and dangerously unconstitutional. Jefferson put it this way: the government created by this compact was not made the exclusive or final judge of the extent of the powers delegated to itself, since that would have made its discretion and not the Constitution the measure of its powers. Now let's look at the second part of the Convention of the States' dismissal of your right to resist unconstitutional acts of government. They have no realistic chance of success. Well, tell that to the Georgia legislature and Governor Deal and the other 25 states that have declined to set up ACA insurance exchanges. In the last session of the General Assembly, the Georgia Health Care Freedom and ACA Non-Compliance Act passed and was signed into law, and it prohibits state agencies and officials from assisting the implementation of Obamacare. Likewise, the Convention of States might try to tell that to the people of Missouri, who by a large majority just this August approved a state constitutional amendment that nullifies federal gun control enforcement in the Show Me state. Missouri joins 381 sheriffs, 15 sheriffs associations, and the National Sheriff's Association in their defiance of unconstitutional federal gun control acts. COS advocates might also try to tell that to the 26 states that have decriminalized cannabis, or the 24 that are refusing to abide by the Real ID Act. Saying no to unconstitutional federal acts is not realistic, unrealistic, it's actually happening. Just saying no is spreading as more states, blue and purple as well as red, are stepping up, and step by step federalism and the rule of law are being restored. I see I'm running out of time here, so I'll quickly skip over some things. As citizens across the nation keep the pressure on their governors and legislatures not to participate in or even bar unconstitutional federal acts, the federal government will have little choice but to limit its activities to the powers delegated. So let's don't waste precious time and expose the nation to the risks involved in a constitutional convention when we can and are resisting unconstitutional federal acts by just saying no.